My name is Claire Matthews, and I'm 31 years old. This happened in early October last year during a solo trip to Cathedral Gorge State Park in Nevada. I'd always been an adventurer, a seeker of the strange and the beautiful, but nothing could have prepared me for what I found in those narrow, clay-etched canyons. It was supposed to be just another stop for my travel blog. My niche is finding remote, underrated locations and writing about their hidden beauty. Cathedral Gorge, with its eerie slot canyons and sparse crowds, seemed like the perfect place for my next feature, Hidden Haunts of Nevada. That title would prove far more literal than I'd planned. I arrived at the park just before sunset, the clay formations glowing orange under the fading light. I parked my RV in the designated camping area, where I was one of only 2 vehicles. The other, a beaten-up truck, belonged to the park ranger I'd later meet. That first night, the silence was almost too perfect. I've camped in plenty of isolated places, but something about this quiet was different. Heavy, like the land itself was holding its breath. As I settled in for the night, editing photos I'd taken earlier, I heard something outside. It was faint at first, like laughter carried on the wind. I opened the RV door and stepped out, flashlight in hand. The air was cool, the stars impossibly bright, but there was no one there. No rustling of leaves, no animal sounds, just the laughter, distant and fleeting. Shaking off the unease, I convinced myself it was nothing and went back inside. The next morning, I was approached by the park ranger as I prepared to hike into the canyons. His name was Jim Harper, a grizzled man with a weathered face and piercing blue eyes. "You heading into the canyons alone?" he asked, his tone casual but his expression sharp. "Yeah, that's the plan," I replied, tightening the straps on my backpack. "Looking to get some photos for my blog?" Jim nodded slowly. "Just stick to the marked trails, and don't linger after dark." "Why not?" I asked, curious. He hesitated. "Just, accidents happen out here. People get turned around. You'd be surprised how easy it is to lose track of time." I could tell there was more he wasn't saying, but I didn't press him. If there's one thing I've learned from my travels, it's that locals love their cryptic warnings. The canyons were everything I'd hoped for. Otherworldly, with narrow walls that stretched high above, carved by centuries of wind and water. My camera captured it all. The way the light played against the clay, the deep shadows that seemed to move with the sun. But then my camera malfunctioned. The screen flickered, and the device powered down without warning. Frustrated, I pulled out my phone, only for it to lose signal entirely. My drone, too, refused to connect. Technology wasn't on my side, but I chalked it up to poor reception and kept going. That's when I saw them. Fleeting shapes at the edge of my vision. Small figures darting between the canyon walls. I paused, heart racing, and scanned the area. Nothing. The wind picked up, carrying with it a faint, high-pitched giggle. It sounded like children playing. "Hello?" I called out, my voice echoing back to me. No response. A few minutes later, I stumbled across something unusual. A collection of old toys partially buried in the clay. There were ragged dolls, tin soldiers, and a small wooden train. I snapped a photo with my phone, making a mental note to research the history of the park later. For now, I was focused on the growing sense that I wasn't alone. That night, back at the RV, I reviewed my photos. The images of the toys were there, but the ones I'd taken earlier in the day, of the canyon walls and formations, were completely gone. My frustration was short-lived, however, when I noticed something else. On the windows of my RV were tiny handprints, as if made by a child's dusty fingers. They hadn't been there before, and I knew I hadn't touched the windows myself. My stomach turned as I tried to rationalize it. Maybe they'd been there earlier and I just hadn't noticed. Maybe. I couldn't sleep that night. Every creak of the RV, every gust of wind sent my heart racing. Around 3 a.m., I heard it again. The laughter. This time, it was closer, circling the RV like a predator testing its prey. The next morning, I went back to the canyons, determined to figure out what was happening. This time, I ventured deeper into the labyrinth, ignoring Jim's warnings and the nagging voice in my head telling me to leave. The shapes appeared again, more clearly now, small, shadowy figures that flitted just out of reach. As I followed them, I found myself in an unmarked area, the walls of the canyon narrowing so tightly that I had to turn sideways to squeeze through. At the end of the path was a strange carving in the rock. Crude figures of children surrounded by a massive, dark shape. Below the carving was an inscription I couldn't read, worn down by time. The air grew colder, and the shadows began to take shape. They weren't just children. Their faces were pale and hollow, their eyes empty sockets. They stared at me, their heads tilted at unnatural angles. "Leave," one of them whispered, its voice overlapping with the others. "You don't belong here." I stumbled back, heart pounding, and ran, but the shadows followed, their presence pressing against me like a physical weight. Back at the RV, I found Jim waiting for me. He looked grim, as if he'd expected this. "They're the children of the flood," he said without preamble. "Back in the 20s, a flash flood swept through the canyons, trapped a group of kids on a field trip. They never made it out." "And the thing with them?" I asked, my voice shaking. Jim's expression darkened. "Something else came with the water, something that feeds on fear. The children are its anchor, keeping it tied to this place." "Why didn't you tell me this before?" I snapped, anger masking my fear. "Would you have believed me?" Jim and I returned to the canyon, carrying the toys I'd found earlier. He explained that the only way to quiet the spirits was to give them something they'd lost, something to remember who they were before the flood. As we laid the toys at the base of the carving, the shadows emerged again, their movements more erratic. The air grew thick, and the canyon walls seemed to close in. Then it came. The entity. A massive, dark shape that blocked out the light, its form constantly shifting. It didn't attack but loomed over us, its presence suffocating. My chest tightened, and I struggled to breathe. "Don't look at it," Jim warned, his voice barely audible over the pounding in my ears. We completed the offering, and the children began to fade, their faces softening into something almost human. But the entity remained, watching, waiting. By the time we returned to the RV, the sun was setting. Jim told me to leave and not come back, his face a mask of exhaustion. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. For a moment, I saw a child's face staring back at me, her expression blank. Then she was gone. I never wrote about what really happened at the Cathedral Gorge. Instead, I focused on the park's beauty and its history, leaving out the parts no one would believe. But sometimes, late at night, I hear faint laughter outside my window, and I wonder if I truly left it all behind. My name is Jordan Mills, and I'm 27 years old. This happened last fall during a solo trip to Pyramid Lake in Nevada. I was there for work. I'm a freelance environmental journalist, traveling in my RV to write a feature about endangered ecosystems in the western United States. The trip started like any other, but by the end, I realized that some stories are better left untold. I arrived at Pyramid Lake in the early afternoon. The place was beautiful in an unsettling way. The water stretched out like a mirror, reflecting the sky so perfectly it seemed impossible. The shore was barren, dotted with rocks and patches of dry, yellowed grass. I parked my RV near the edge of the lake and stepped outside, inhaling the sharp, cool air. The stillness was unnerving. No birds, no wind, just the faint sound of water lapping against the rocks. I spent the rest of the day exploring the area, snapping photos and taking notes. I was writing about the delicate balance of the lake's ecosystem and the cultural significance of the land to the Paiute people. I'd read a bit about their legends, including stories of water spirits that haunted the lake, but I chalked them up to folklore. That night, as I reviewed my notes in the RV, I had no idea what I was about to uncover. The first strange thing happened the next morning. I woke up early and headed to the shore with my camera. The sun was just rising, casting everything in a soft golden light. As I crouched by the water to take a photo, I noticed something odd. A pile of fish carcasses arranged in a spiral pattern just a few feet away. The fish were dried out, their eyes sunken, as if they'd been there for days. I frowned. There were no scavengers around, no sign of decay. The arrangement felt deliberate, but I couldn't figure out why. I took a few pictures and moved on, brushing off the unease creeping up my spine. Later that day, I stopped at a small bait shop to ask about the fish. That's where I met Hank Barrett. He was the owner, grizzled, wiry, and about 50-something, with a face weathered by years of sun and wind. I told him about the carcasses, and he listened without interrupting, his blue eyes narrowing as I spoke. "You hear any whistling out there?" he asked when I finished. "Whistling?" I said, confused. "No. Why?" Hank leaned on the counter, his expression serious. "If you hear it, don't follow it, and don't go near the water after dark." I laughed nervously, thinking he was joking, but his face didn't change. "What are you talking about?" "People disappear around here," he said, his voice low. "Always the same story. They hear the whistle, see something out on the water, and they're gone. Locals call it the Whistler." It sounded ridiculous, a ghost story meant to spook tourists. I thanked him and left, convinced he was trying to scare me. But as the day wore on, his words lingered in my mind. That night, the first whistle came. I was lying in bed staring at the ceiling when I heard it, a low, melodic sound drifting through the still air. It was faint at first, almost like birdsong, but it grew louder, more distinct. I sat up, my pulse quickening. It sounded human, like someone whistling a tune just outside my RV. I grabbed a flashlight and stepped outside. The air was cold, and the lake shimmered under the moonlight. I swept the beam of light across the shore, but saw nothing. The whistle continued, coming from the direction of the water. "Hello?" I called out, my voice shaking slightly. "Is someone there?" The whistle stopped. The silence that followed was heavier than before, pressing down on me. I scanned the area one last time before retreating to the RV, locking the door behind me. The next morning, I tried to convince myself it had been the wind or some animal, but the strange occurrences didn't stop. My camera malfunctioned, erasing the photos I'd taken the previous day. My notes vanished, even though I was sure I'd left them on the RV's table. At night, the whistle came back, louder this time and closer. I started dreaming about the lake. In the dreams, a figure stood at the water's edge, its face hidden in shadow. It called my name in a voice that sounded eerily familiar. When I woke, the sound of the whistle echoed in my ears. By the third day, I couldn't focus on my work. The pull of the lake was too strong. I found myself wandering the shore for hours, staring at the water as if waiting for something to appear. It felt like the lake was alive, watching me, testing me. I went back to the bait shop to confront Hank. "What's happening to me?" I demanded as soon as I stepped inside. What is the Whistler? Hank sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. It's a water spirit, he said finally. Old Paiute legend. They say it's tied to a woman who drowned here a long time ago, betrayed by settlers, filled with rage. She calls people to the lake, uses their fears against them. And then what? I asked, though I already knew the answer. They don't come back. I stared at him, anger and fear twisting in my chest. Why didn't you tell me this earlier? Would you have believed me? That night, I made a decision. I wasn't going to let the Whistler control me. I set up my camera at the edge of the lake, determined to capture whatever was out there. The whistle came, low and haunting, but I stayed put, gripping the camera tightly. The water rippled, though there was no wind. A figure emerged from the lake, its shape shimmering like heat waves. It was humanoid but wrong. Its limbs too long, its movements too fluid. Its face was a blank canvas, featureless and smooth. Jordan, it whispered, its voice a perfect mimicry of my own. Come closer. I froze, my heart pounding. It took a step toward me and I stumbled back, tripping over a rock. The whistle grew louder, more piercing, filling my head like a scream. Suddenly, Hank was there. He tossed a bundle of sage into the lake, muttering words in a language I didn't recognize. The figure writhed, its form dissolving into the water. The whistle faded, leaving only silence. Hank helped me back to my RV, his face pale and drawn. Leave, he said. Don't come back. I didn't argue. I packed my things and left before dawn. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. For a split second, I saw the figure standing on the shore, watching me. Then it was gone. I never wrote about what happened at Pyramid Lake. Some stories are too dangerous to share. But sometimes, late at night, I hear a faint whistle in the wind, and I wonder if it's still following me. My name is Elena Torres, and I'm 34 years old. Last October, I took my RV on a solo trip to Nevada, searching for inspiration for my next series of wildlife illustrations. I ended up at Desert Moon Trail, a remote hiking path in the Mojave Desert. It's the kind of place that feels untouched by time, where the quiet wraps around you so tightly it almost hums. I thought I'd find solitude and creative renewal there. Instead, I found something that I can barely bring myself to believe. I pulled my RV into a clearing near the trailhead just before dusk. The desert stretched out endlessly, the red rock formations glowing faintly in the last light of the day. It was barren, harsh, and eerily beautiful. The perfect setting for my work. My plan was simple. Hike the trail during the day, sketch the landscapes and wildlife, and return to my RV at night to refine my drawings. It wasn't my first time camping alone, and I'd never had a problem before. But as I stepped out to get a closer look at the trailhead sign, I noticed an old woman watching me from a distance. She stood next to a dilapidated shack just beyond the clearing, leaning heavily on a cane. Her face was obscured by a wide-brimmed hat, but I could feel her eyes on me. It was unnerving, but I waved anyway. She didn't wave back. As I unpacked my supplies, the woman shuffled over. Up close, she was smaller than I'd expected, her frame hunched and fragile. Her face was deeply lined, her skin browned by the sun, but her eyes were sharp and piercing. "Trail's cursed, you know," she said without introduction. Her voice was gravelly, her words clipped. "Cursed?" I asked, raising an eyebrow. "That sounds dramatic." "Call it what you want," she said, pointing her cane toward the rocky horizon. "The witch doesn't like strangers poking around." I smiled politely, not wanting to be rude, but my skepticism must have shown. "Thanks for the warning. I'll be careful." She grunted, unimpressed. You should leave before it gets dark. Too late now for most people." She shuffled away without another word, leaving me alone in the growing twilight. The next morning, I set out early with my sketchpad and pencils, eager to explore. The trail wound through narrow canyons and open stretches of desert, the red rocks forming jagged silhouettes against the blue sky. It was stunning, and I quickly lost myself in the work. Around noon, I stumbled across something strange. Carved into the surface of a large rock were symbols, intricate spirals and angular runes that didn't look like they belonged. I knelt down to sketch them, fascinated by their precision. I thought about the old woman's warning but dismissed it as local superstition. These carvings were probably just remnants of some long-forgotten culture. That night, as I reviewed my sketches in the RV, I heard scratching. It started faintly, like a branch brushing against the side of the vehicle. Then it grew louder, more insistent. I grabbed a flashlight and opened the door, stepping out into the cool desert air. My breath caught in my throat. There were no trees near my RV. Nothing could have been scratching it. The next morning, I discovered something even stranger. My sketch of the symbols was gone, ripped clean from my pad. I knew I hadn't torn it out, and I hadn't left the RV unlocked. I searched everywhere but found no trace of it. Frustrated but determined, I went back to the trail to start again. As I ventured further, the landscape became more rugged. The wind picked up, carrying with it a low whispering sound that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I told myself it was just the wind funneling through the rocks, but it felt intentional, like it was following me. Deeper into the trail, I found a stone circle, the center marked with the same symbols I'd sketched the day before. The carvings seemed fresher here, their edges sharp and precise. As I stood there, staring at the markings, the whispering grew louder, forming words I couldn't quite understand. A shadow moved at the edge of my vision. I spun around, my heart hammering, but there was nothing there. Just the endless expanse of desert. That night, I went back to the old woman's shack. I found her sitting on a rickety chair staring out at the desert. She didn't seem surprised to see me. "You saw her, didn't you?" she said, her voice heavy with certainty. "I don't know what I saw," I admitted, my voice trembling. "But something's out there, something wrong." She nodded slowly, as if she'd been expecting this. "They called her a witch, said she cursed the land when they burned her alive. All she did was try to heal the sick, but that didn't matter to them. They needed someone to blame." "What does she want?" I asked. Maeve's eyes narrowed. "To make sure no one forgets what they did to her, and to punish anyone who disturbs her rest." I couldn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the stone circle and the symbols, felt the weight of the whispering voices. Around midnight, I heard something outside. It wasn't scratching this time. It was footsteps. I peeked through the RV window and froze. Standing at the edge of the clearing was a figure cloaked in shadows. She was gaunt, her body unnaturally tall and thin, her face obscured by the hood of her robe. But her eyes glowed, two pinpoints of pale light that seemed to pierce through the darkness. She raised one hand, her fingers impossibly long, and pointed directly at me. I scrambled back, my heart pounding. The RV door rattled violently, as if something was trying to force it open. I pressed my back against the wall, clutching the flashlight like it was a weapon. After what felt like an eternity, the rattling stopped. When I looked outside again, she was gone. The next day, I returned to the stone circle, desperate to end whatever this was. I brought Maeve with me, clutching her bundle of sage and muttering prayers under her breath. As we approached the circle, the air grew heavy. the temperature dropping sharply despite the midday sun. The witch was waiting. She rose from the center of the circle, her form flickering like a flame. Her voice filled the air, a cacophony of whispers and screams. "You should not have come," she said, her words echoing inside my head. Maeve stepped forward, her hands trembling. "We're here to make it right," she said, "to honor your pain." The witch tilted her head, her glowing eyes narrowing. "You cannot undo what has been done." The ground beneath us shook, and I fell to my knees. Maeve lit the sage and began chanting, her voice steady despite the chaos around us. The witch shrieked, her form twisting and writhing. The wind howled, and the circle of stones began to crack. Then Maeve turned to me, her eyes filled with a sad kind of determination. "Go," she said. "This is my burden to bear." Before I could protest, the witch lunged at her, and they both vanished in a blinding flash of light. I woke up outside the circle, the desert silent once more. The stones were gone, as if they'd never been there. Maeve was nowhere to be found. I searched for hours, calling her name, but there was no sign of her. I returned to my RV, my sketches intact, and drove away from Desert Moon Trail, vowing never to return. When I finally put my pen to paper again, I created a series of paintings unlike anything I'd ever done before. Haunting, raw, and filled with the shadow of what I'd seen. To this day, I still hear the whispers sometimes, faint and far away. I don't know if they're real or just memories, but one thing I'm certain of, some places should be left alone. My name is Claire Robinson, and I'm 29 years old. This happened in May last year, and I still can't talk about it without looking over my shoulder. I used to think I was the kind of person who could handle anything. A breakup, a bad boss, or even the wilderness. But what we faced in Leville Canyon, nothing could prepare me for that. It started as a simple camping trip. I wanted to get out of the city for a few days, leave the noise and my failed relationship behind. I convinced my friends Max, Tracy, and Drew to join me. Lamoille Canyon seemed perfect. Remote, quiet, and surrounded by nature. The kind of place where you could breathe. Max, ever the thrill-seeker, was in charge of picking the trail. He found an unmarked path, one not listed on any maps. "It'll be an adventure," he'd said, grinning as he showed us the vague directions from a forum post. Drew, the quiet one, shrugged. Tracy looked uncomfortable from the start. "I've heard stories about this place," she said as we loaded up the RV. "People disappearing, weird stuff happening." Max rolled his eyes. "Oh, come on, Tracy, that's just campfire tales. Ghosts aren't real." I laughed to ease the tension. "We'll be fine. It's just a weekend. What's the worst that could happen?" We arrived late, the sun casting long shadows through the canyon. Max's tent turned out to be useless. It collapsed the moment he tried to set it up. "Guess I'm bunking with you, Claire," he said, flashing that lopsided grin. I didn't argue. I was too tired to care. The first night felt normal enough. The air was cool, the stars were bright, and the only sounds were the chirping of crickets. But as I drifted off, I thought I heard whispers. Faint, almost too soft to notice. I told myself it was just the wind. The next morning, we found the trail Max had talked about. It was narrow, overgrown, and littered with fallen branches. Half a mile in, we saw the first of the symbols, strange runes carved into tree trunks. They looked ancient, the lines rough and jagged, as if made by trembling hands. "Probably just vandals," Max said, though even he sounded unsure. Tracy refused to go any further. "This place feels wrong," she said, her voice trembling. "I'm not going. I'll wait here." "Alone? In the middle of nowhere?" Max teased, but Tracy didn't budge. Reluctantly, we left her by the trailhead. The hike was supposed to be short, but something was off. Drew checked his watch and frowned. "We've been walking for 3 hours." "That's not possible," I said. "We started at 9. It should be 11, tops." He showed me the watch, 1:15 p.m. None of us could explain the missing time. Max laughed it off, but I could see the tension in his shoulders. We turned back, only to find Tracy pale and shaking. "You left me here too long," she said, her voice cracking. "It's almost dark." "It's the middle of the day," I said, confused. Tracy pointed to the sky. The sun was already dipping below the horizon. That night, the atmosphere changed. We ate a quiet dinner around the campfire, but no one joked or laughed. The wind carried a foul stench, like something rotting, and the whispers returned. This time, they were louder. Distinct. "Do you hear that?" I asked. Max shook his head, but Drew nodded. "It sounds like our names." I didn't sleep well. At some point, I woke to find Tracy standing in the clearing, staring at the woods. "Tracy," I whispered, "what are you doing?" She turned to me, her eyes glassy. "It's calling me." The next morning, I found the first of Drew's photos. He'd been taking pictures of the trail, but in one of them, there was something else. A dark, humanoid figure standing behind the trees. Its limbs were too long, its head crowned with antlers. I showed the others. "It's just a trick of the light," Max said, but he looked nervous. Tracy refused to speak, her eyes fixed on the ground. That night, we heard footsteps circling the RV. Drew peeked outside and froze. "There's something out there." Max grabbed a flashlight and stormed out. "It's just an animal." His words cut off abruptly, and he stumbled back inside, pale and shaking. "It's watching us," he whispered. Desperate for answers, we followed Drew's photos to an old altar deep in the woods. It was surrounded by bones. Animal, maybe human, and strange symbols burned into the ground. Tracy collapsed, clutching her head. "She's been marked," Drew said, his voice grim. "What does that mean?" I demanded. He pointed to a symbol on the altar that matched the one burned into Tracy's wrist. "This is her curse. Ours too." A shadow fell over us. The witch, tall, skeletal, and crowned with antlers, stood at the edge of the clearing. Her eyes glowed like embers, and when she opened her mouth, the whispers poured out, deafening and cold. We ran. The witch didn't follow, but seemed to appear wherever we turned. We made it back to camp, only to find the RV surrounded by the same symbols from the altar. Tracy screamed, her voice raw and desperate. "It's in my head! She's in my head!" Max finally snapped. "We have to fight back. We destroy that altar." Drew and I hesitated, but Max's determination was infectious. "I'll distract her," he said. "You two take care of the altar." "You'll die," I said. He smiled weakly. "Better me than all of us." Max's screams echoed through the forest as we smashed the altar with rocks and sticks. The witch's cries joined his, a shriek of rage that shook the ground beneath us. Tracy fainted, her body going limp. When the altar finally crumbled, the symbols around the RV disappeared, and the witch was gone. Max didn't return. We found his flashlight near the clearing, its lens shattered. We drove out of Leville Canyon in silence. Tracy hasn't spoken since that night. Drew's photos, once filled with evidence, are now blank. And Max, we reported him missing, but no one ever found a trace of him. I still hear the whispers sometimes. In the wind, in the stillness of the night, they call my name. I don't answer. My name is Evan Carver, and I'm 35 years old. What I'm about to tell you happened last year during a road trip across Nevada. I'm not the kind of person who believes in ghosts or curses, or at least I wasn't before this. Even now, I can barely make sense of it. All I know is I'll never go back to that place, and if you value your sanity, you shouldn't either. It started as a spur-of-the-moment decision. I'd been driving all day, heading nowhere in particular, when I saw the turnoff. There was no sign, just a narrow dirt road winding into the desert. I was tired, hungry, and curious. My RV wasn't exactly a powerhouse, but it handled the rough terrain without too much complaint. About 3 miles in, I found it. A cluster of overgrown campsites nestled in the shadow of a rocky hill. An old wooden sign leaned precariously near the entrance. It read, "Welcome to Dry Gulch Campground. Established 1942. Beneath it, in faded red paint, someone had scrawled, "Leave before dark." I should have turned around right then, but instead I laughed. Probably some local kids trying to scare tourists, I said to no one in particular. My voice sounded too loud in the stillness. The air was dry and unnaturally quiet. The kind of quiet that makes your ears strain for a sound, any sound. I parked the RV near the remnants of an old picnic area. The tables were warped and rotting, and the fire pits were filled with crumbling ash. It was clear no one had camped here in years. Perfect for me. I liked my solitude, and the history professor in me couldn't resist the allure of a forgotten place. The first problem cropped up almost immediately. My RV's battery was low, which meant the lights flickered unpredictably, casting strange shadows on the walls. I told myself it was fine. I had a lantern, and besides, I wasn't planning to stay up late. The second problem was my propane stove. It sputtered and died after barely warming my can of soup. I sighed and ate it cold, staring out at the barren landscape. The sun was setting, painting the desert in shades of orange and red. It should have been beautiful, but it felt wrong. Like the colors were too vivid, too intense. Like the desert was trying too hard to distract me from something. After dinner, I decided to stretch my legs. The campground was small, maybe half a dozen sites in total, but it was clear no one had been here in decades. At one site I found a rusted cooler filled with sand and a tent so shredded it barely resembled fabric. Deep scratches marred the wooden picnic table, as if someone, or something, had raked claws across it. Near the edge of the campground, I stumbled upon an old RV. It was a hulking relic from the 1970s, its paint peeling and windows coated in grime. The door hung ajar, creaking softly in the wind. Against my better judgment, I stepped inside. The smell hit me first, a sickly sweet stench of decay. The interior was a mess of broken furniture and scattered belongings. Among the debris, I found a stack of Polaroid photos. The images were warped and faded, but they all showed the same thing: blurry, shadowy figures standing in the desert. My pulse quickened as I flipped through them. In the last photo, the figure wasn't blurry at all. It stood perfectly clear, staring straight at the camera. Its eyes glowed faintly, like embers. I left the RV in a hurry. By the time I got back to my RV, the sun had dipped below the horizon. The desert was bathed in blue-gray twilight, and the silence felt oppressive. I turned on my lantern and settled in for the night, trying to push the photos out of my mind. That's when I heard it. A faint voice calling my name. "Evan!" I froze, the spoon halfway to my mouth. The voice came again, drifting on the wind. It was soft, almost melodic, but there was something wrong about it. It sounded familiar, like my father's voice, but twisted, distorted. "Evan." I grabbed the lantern and stepped outside, scanning the campground. There was no one there. just the empty sights and the whispering wind. My heart was racing now, my rational mind struggling to keep control. I told myself it was just my imagination, that the isolation was playing tricks on me. But then I saw the footprints. They were large and uneven, like someone, or something, was dragging one leg. They started near my RV and led straight to the door. But here's the thing, there were no footprints leading away. I spent the rest of the night huddled inside the RV, every light on. The radio turned on by itself around midnight, blaring static mixed with faint whispers. I smashed the power button, but the static kept playing until the lantern flickered and died. That's when I saw it. A shadow moved past the window. It was tall, hunched, and impossibly thin. My breath caught in my throat as I watched it circle the RV. It didn't make a sound, but I could feel it watching me, its presence pressing against my mind like a weight. I don't know how I made it through the night. When the first rays of sunlight broke over the hills, the shadow vanished, but the footprints were still there. Desperate for answers, I went back to the abandoned RV. This time, I found a journal buried under a pile of debris. The pages were brittle and stained, but I could still make out the handwriting. The entries started off normal enough, descriptions of hikes, notes about the weather, but then they took a darker turn. The voices started last night. They sound like my wife, but she's been dead for 3 years. Something is out there. I see it watching me from the ridge. It feeds on loneliness. It knows what you fear. Don't stay after dark. Don't listen to the whispers. The final entry was a scrawl of frantic words. The hungry ones. They come when you're alone. They feed on what you hide. By midday, I was ready to leave. I packed up the RV and tried to start the engine. Nothing. I turned the key again, harder this time. Still nothing. Panic set in as I checked the battery. It was drained, completely dead. I decided to hike out and find help. With a flashlight and a canteen, I headed down the dirt road. But after an hour of walking, I realized something was wrong. The road kept looping back to the campground. No matter which direction I went, I always ended up back at Dry Gulch. The shadows returned as the sun dipped low in the sky. They were closer now, moving just at the edge of my vision. The whispers grew louder, their tone mocking, taunting. "Evan, you can't leave." I stumbled to the journal's altar-like warnings, clutching a photo I'd taken of the altar's hasty scribes intent ===, trying, diapersate, to summon bravery. Here's the continuation of the suspense-filled short story based on the outline. By the time I staggered back to the RV, the sun was setting again, casting the desert in deep shadows. The whispers followed me, growing louder, almost laughing now. My flashlight flickered, and I felt the weight of the shadows pressing closer. I clenched the journal in my hand. It was the only guide I had, even if it offered more fear than solutions. The scrawled warnings about the hungry ones played over and over in my mind. They feed on what you hide. I needed to confront whatever was happening, but I couldn't think clearly. My breath came in shallow gasps as I climbed back into the RV and slammed the door shut. Inside, the radio clicked on again, hissing static, and then, through the static, a voice. My father's. "Evan, why didn't you come home sooner?" The voice tore at my heart. My father and I hadn't spoken in years before his death, and I'd avoided his funeral out of guilt. Hearing him now was like a blade in my chest, cutting through my logic and skepticism. "You left me," the voice said, and suddenly the shadows outside pressed against the RV windows. Their shapes twisted and grew, filling the panes with elongated limbs and hollow faces. My breathing hitched, and I shut my eyes, trying to will them away. But the journal's warning came back to me. They feed on what you hide. I'd hidden my guilt about my father. I'd buried it so deep I'd convinced myself it wasn't there. And now, these things were dragging it into the light. I grabbed the flashlight and the journal, pushing open the RV door. The shadows recoiled slightly at the light, but didn't retreat. Their whispers turned into guttural growls, mocking and guttural. "Why?" they hissed. "Why didn't you try? Why didn't you come home?" Tears blurred my vision as I shouted back, "I'm sorry. I was scared, okay? I was angry, and I didn't know how to face him. I was wrong." For a moment, the air seemed to shift. The shadows paused, as if considering my words. But then they surged forward again, faster this time, hungrier. I stumbled back, holding up the journal like a shield. "What do you want from me?" The journal slipped from my hand, landing open on the ground. The flashlight's beam hit the pages, illuminating the final frantic scrawl. Beneath the chaotic words, there was one clear phrase I hadn't noticed before. "Burn it. The altar." The thought hit me like a bolt of lightning. I remembered the scattered stones and burned symbols near the abandoned RV. That must have been where the previous campers tried to stop them. I ran. My legs felt heavy, as if the shadows were gripping my ankles, but I pushed forward, flashlight shaking in my hands. The altar wasn't far, and when I reached it, I saw the charred remains of old offerings, bones, rocks, and scraps of paper. Using the lighter from my pocket, I ignited a piece of cloth from the altar. The flame sputtered and grew, casting eerie light across the clearing. The shadows screamed, a high-pitched, inhuman wail that sent shivers down my spine. They recoiled, their forms stretching and distorting. I grabbed the journal and tossed it onto the flames. The pages caught quickly, curling and blackening as the fire consumed them. The whispers turned into shrieks, and the shadows dissolved into the night, their shapes scattering like ash on the wind. The silence that followed was deafening. The wind had stopped, and the air felt lighter, almost clean. I stood there for what felt like hours, staring at the smoldering altar until the first rays of sunlight broke over the horizon. Back at the RV, the engine started on the first try. Relief washed over me as I pulled onto the dirt road, and this time it didn't loop back to the campground. I drove without stopping until I reached the nearest gas station. Weeks later, I sat in my apartment, surrounded by books and notes. I'd been trying to research Dry Gulch campground, but I couldn't find any records of its existence. No maps, no articles, nothing. It was as if the place had been erased from history. One night, as I was sorting through my papers, I heard a faint whisper. "Evan." I froze, the hair on my neck standing on end. The voice was quieter now, distant but unmistakable. I turned slowly, scanning the empty room. And then I saw it. A single Polaroid lying on my desk. It showed the shadowy figure I'd seen in the abandoned RV, its glowing eyes staring directly at me. My name is Marta Ellis, and I'm 42 years old. What I'm about to share happened last summer during a solo road trip across Nevada. I'm a freelance photographer, and my work takes me to places most people would never think to visit. Old mining towns, forgotten trails, crumbling ruins. These are my sanctuaries, or at least they were. I haven't set foot in the desert since that day. I was driving through the Nevada desert, heading towards Death Valley, when my GPS froze. The blue dot stopped moving, and I found myself on an empty stretch of road with no signal. The desert stretched endlessly in every direction, the sun beating down mercilessly. I didn't panic. I'd handled worse situations before. That's when I saw it. A faded wooden sign on the side of the road. Rhyolite, 10 miles. I'd heard of Rhyolite before. It was a ghost town from the early 1900s, abandoned after a brief gold rush. The thought of capturing it through my lens thrilled me. I turned onto the unmarked dirt road without hesitation, my RV kicking up a trail of dust as I headed toward the town. Rhyolite appeared suddenly, rising out of the desolation like a mirage. Sun-bleached buildings lined a single dusty street, their windows empty and dark. There was a general store, a saloon, a hotel, all eerily intact, as if the town had been preserved in amber. I parked my RV near the edge of the town and stepped out, camera in hand. The silence was the first thing I noticed. No birds, no insects, not even the sound of the wind. It was the kind of silence that pressed against your ears, making you feel like you were being watched. The general store was my first stop. Shelves still held rusted cans and dusty bottles, and a mannequin in a faded dress stood behind the counter. I snapped a few photos, but something was wrong. My camera refused to focus, the images coming out blurred and distorted. Frustrated, I moved on. The saloon was empty, save for overturned chairs and a long-forgotten piano. The keys were cracked, and when I ran my fingers across them, they emitted a hollow, tuneless sound. As I turned to leave, I thought I saw movement in the corner of my eye, a shadow darting behind the bar. I froze, my pulse quickening, but when I looked again, the room was empty. I returned to the general store later in the afternoon. The mannequin behind the counter had changed position. Its head, which had been tilted down earlier, was now turned to face me. I stared at it, my skin crawling. It had to be a trick of my memory. I took a step closer, and the faint ticking of a clock echoed through the store. But there were no clocks. I left in a hurry. As the sun began to set, I decided it was time to leave. But when I got back to the RV, the dirt road I'd driven in on was gone. In its place was an unbroken expanse of desert. I circled the town, searching for another way out, but there was nothing. The wooden sign that had read Rhyolite. 10 miles was still there, but the words had faded, leaving the wood blank. My stomach tightened with unease. Determined to document the town while I still had light, I returned to the hotel. The staircase creaked under my weight as I climbed to the second floor. The rooms were sparse, with old iron bed frames and cracked mirrors. In one room, I found a journal on the floor. The pages were brittle, but the writing was legible. The entries started innocuously enough, descriptions of the desert, notes about the heat. But the tone shifted midway through. They're watching me. I don't know who they are, but I feel their eyes. They want me to stay. I heard a faint laugh behind me, low and raspy. Whipping around, I saw nothing but an empty hallway. But when I turned back to the journal, the last line had changed. Fresh words had appeared, written in a shaky hand. You can't leave. Back in the RV, the temperature plummeted as darkness fell. The desert outside was pitch black, the only light coming from the moon. My fuel gauge, which had been nearly full, now read empty. The RV wouldn't start. The radio clicked on by itself, playing a scratchy recording of old-timey music. I turned it off, but it clicked back on moments later, this time with distorted voices murmuring over the music. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside, desperate to find a way out. That's when I saw them. Figures stood in the shadows of the buildings, their outlines faint but unmistakable. There were at least a dozen, their glowing eyes fixed on me. They didn't move, but I felt their intent like a physical weight. They wanted me to stay. I stumbled into the hotel, the figures following at a distance. My flashlight beam flickered, casting the room in strobe-like shadows. In the lobby, I found a large, cracked mirror hanging on the wall. My reflection stared back at me, but it wasn't right. It was smiling. A wide, unnatural grin that I hadn't made. The journal's mention of the mirror came back to me. It's the way out, but they won't let you use it. The figures were closer now, their footsteps echoing on the wooden floors. My reflection's grin faded, replaced by a pleading expression. I had no other choice. I pressed my palm against the mirror. It was cold, almost painfully so. The reflection began to shift, showing flashes of the desert, the RV, and my mother's face. The sight of her brought a lump to my throat. She had passed away only months before, and her loss still felt like an open wound. The figures surrounded me now, their whispers growing louder. "Stay with us," they said. "You belong here." Tears streamed down my face as I focused on the memory of my mother. Her voice, her laugh, the way she used to encourage my photography, it all came flooding back. The mirror pulsed under my hand, and then, with a blinding flash, I was through. I woke up in the RV, parked on the side of a paved road. The ghost town was nowhere in sight. My fuel gauge was back to full, and my camera worked perfectly. But every photo I'd taken in Rhyolite was blank. I drove straight to the nearest gas station where I sat for hours, trying to convince myself it was all a dream. But when I rolled up my sleeve, I saw a faint, jagged mark on my arm. The exact spot where one of the figures had grabbed me as I escaped. Weeks later, while editing my photos, I found something I couldn't explain. In one image, a shot of the general store's interior, the mannequin was there. But it wasn't behind the counter. It was standing in the doorway, staring straight at me. My name is Max Turner, and I was 27 when this happened. It was the kind of trip that's supposed to be unforgettable. 4 friends escaping the grind of city life, exploring the vast emptiness of Nevada's Black Rock Desert. And it was unforgettable, just not in the way I imagined. Looking back, I should have listened to my gut and turned the RV around before we ever reached the Devil's Playground. It started with Jenna's idea. She was always the adventurous one in our group, the kind of person who could find a local legend in every backwater town. She was obsessed with folklore, and her latest fascination was the cursed stretch of desert where shadows don't behave and people supposedly vanish into thin air. "It'll be fun," she said, her hazel eyes gleaming with excitement. "Think of the stories we can tell." I wasn't convinced, but I was the one driving, and Jenna had a way of getting what she wanted. So there we were, me, Jenna, Elliot, and Kara, barreling down the lonely road to nowhere in my beat-up RV. The first thing you notice about the Black Rock Desert is its emptiness. It's not like other deserts with dunes or scrubby vegetation. This place is flat, barren, and eerily silent. No birds, no insects, just the wind whistling over cracked earth. We set up camp near what Jenna claimed was the heart of the Devil's Playground. It wasn't much, just a patch of scorched earth surrounded by jagged black rocks. Elliot, our resident worrywart, immediately started fussing about the lack of cell service and the fact that our GPS wasn't working right. "This place is creepy as hell," Kara muttered as she unloaded gear. She was the sarcastic one in the group, always quick with a snarky comment. But I could tell she wasn't joking this time. "You guys are such babies," Jenna teased. She spun around with her arms outstretched, like she was trying to embrace the void. "Isn't this amazing? No noise, no people, just pure freedom." "Yeah, freedom to die of dehydration," Elliot grumbled, double-checking our water supply. That first night was uneventful, or so I thought. We sat around the campfire telling stories and laughing. But as I lay in my bunk, staring at the RV's ceiling, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The next morning, things started going wrong. For one, our supplies didn't add up. A gallon of water was missing and a bag of trail mix was torn open. Elliot swore he had packed it securely. "What's the big deal?" Jenna said, shrugging. "Probably raccoons or something." "Out here?" Elliot snapped. "There's no wildlife, Jenna. That's what's freaking me out." I tried to calm everyone down and suggested we explore the area. Maybe some fresh air would clear our heads. We piled into the RV and drove east, but no matter which direction I turned, we kept ending up back at the same spot. "This doesn't make sense," I muttered, gripping the wheel tighter. "It's just the desert messing with your sense of direction," Jenna said, though she didn't sound so sure. By mid-afternoon, tensions were running high. Kara and Jenna got into a shouting match over whether we should stay or leave. Elliot kept fiddling with his gadgets, muttering under his breath about magnetic interference. And then, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Kara spotted it. "Do you see that?" she whispered, pointing at a distant ridge. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light. A tall, thin shadow standing unnaturally still against the fading orange sky. But when it moved, my stomach dropped. "Probably just another camper," Jenna said, but she didn't sound convincing. "Yeah, sure," Kara muttered, "because people always camp alone in cursed deserts." That night, the firelight played tricks on my eyes. Shadows seemed to stretch and twist in ways that defied logic. At one point, I swore I saw my own shadow move, even though I was sitting completely still. "Did you guys hear that?" Jenna asked suddenly. Her voice hushed. We all froze. A faint whispering sound was drifting on the wind, so soft it was almost imperceptible. It seemed to come from all directions at once. "It's just the wind," I said, though I didn't believe it. But then Elliot's voice came from behind me. "Max, come here." I turned around, but Elliot was sitting right where he'd been all along, his face pale as a sheet. "Did you just—" I started to ask, but he shook his head violently. The whispering grew louder, more insistent, like a dozen voices overlapping. Jenna bolted into the RV, locking the door behind her. Kara and Elliot followed, leaving me to extinguish the fire. When I climbed inside, Jenna was crying. "It said my name," she whispered. By morning, the group was unraveling. Jenna insisted we leave, but no one could figure out how. The RV kept circling back to the same cursed spot. Elliot's GPS was completely useless, showing us in the middle of a blank screen. As we debated what to do, I noticed Kara acting strangely. She was unusually quiet, staring out the window with an empty expression. When I asked if she was okay, she just shrugged and said, "We're not getting out of here." Jenna, ever the folklore expert, suggested performing a ritual to appease whatever spirits were haunting the place. "We need to leave an offering," she said. "Something valuable, something personal." "That's ridiculous," I snapped. "We're not feeding into this superstitious nonsense." But by nightfall, I was starting to think she might be right. The shadows were no longer just strange. They were alive. They moved independently of their sources, slithering across the ground like living things. And the figures were back, closer this time. One by one, we saw them. Tall, gaunt humanoids with elongated limbs and featureless faces. They didn't attack or even approach, but their presence was suffocating. Elliot's breaking point came when he checked his camera. The footage showed one of the figures standing behind him while he was filming, even though none of us had seen it at the time. "We have to do the ritual," Jenna insisted, her voice shaking. Reluctantly, we gathered around a small fire and left our offerings. Jenna's necklace, Elliot's watch, Kara's bracelet, and my father's old ring. As the flames consumed them, the whispering stopped. For a moment, I thought it had worked. At midnight, I woke to find Kara gone. The door to the RV was wide open, and her footprints led into the darkness. We found her standing in the middle of the Devil's Playground, surrounded by the shadowy figures. She was smiling, but her eyes were blank. "They're not going to let us leave," she said softly. Jenna screamed as Kara's shadow detached itself from her body and slithered away, and then she collapsed. The rest is a blur. We dragged Kara back to the RV and drove until the sun rose. Somehow we found the highway. Somehow we escaped. Epilogue. Kara never recovered. She's alive but unresponsive, trapped in some kind of waking coma. Jenna refuses to talk about what happened, and Elliot moved halfway across the country. As for me, I sold the RV and haven't set foot in the desert since. But sometimes, when the light is just right, I catch a glimpse of a shadow that doesn't belong, and I know the Devil's Playground isn't done with me yet. My name is Kelly Carter. I'm 31 years old, and this happened last year in the Ruby Mountains of Nevada. I've always loved traveling alone. Something about the silence, the independence, the raw connection to the wild. It clears my mind in ways that city life never could. As a travel blogger, I thrive on solitude, on venturing where others won't. But my trip to Lamoille Canyon wasn't just another entry for my blog. It was something darker, something that still haunts me every night. The Ruby Mountains loomed on the horizon, their jagged peaks rising sharply against the deepening blue sky. My RV hummed along the winding road as I navigated deeper into the canyon. This place wasn't just remote, it felt forgotten. Perfect for my blog. I had named the post in my head already, exploring the last frontier of Nevada. I parked the RV in a secluded clearing near a shallow stream. The late afternoon sun bathed the canyon in golden light, and the silence was profound. It wasn't like the quiet of a forest with its rustling leaves and bird calls. This was a void, broken only by the faint whistle of wind through the canyon walls. As I unpacked, I felt a shiver run down my spine. I chalked it up to excitement, or maybe the growing chill as the sun dipped lower. I was alone here, just me and my gear. I couldn't have asked for anything better. The next morning, the world felt different. The sunlight was harsh, bleaching the canyon's colors into a stark, lifeless palette. The stream gurgled quietly, but it sounded distant, muffled. I ignored it. This was exactly what I wanted. Solitude, peace, and time to focus. I set up my drone to capture aerial shots of the canyon, but as soon as it took off, the controls began to lag. The feed glitched, distorting the scenery into pixelated shadows. I managed to land it, but the battery was drained, something that had never happened before. By noon, the first real problem emerged. My GPS wouldn't connect. The screen displayed an endless spinning wheel. "Great," I muttered. "That's what I get for relying on tech." I shrugged it off and decided to explore on foot. The canyon was breathtaking. Ancient rock formations, twisted junipers, and the occasional shimmer of sunlight reflecting off the stream. But as I hiked farther from camp, I noticed something unsettling. Carved into the trees were strange symbols. At first, I thought they were graffiti left by other campers, but these weren't initials or crude drawings. They were intricate, almost like runes, spiraling and jagged. I took pictures for my blog, convincing myself it was nothing but old Native American art, or maybe a weird geological pattern. Then, I heard it. It started as a soft whisper carried on the wind. It wasn't words, just a murmur, faint and rhythmic. I turned, scanning the canyon walls, but no one was there. My pulse quickened, but I forced myself to laugh. Wind. It's just the wind. The night was worse. Darkness fell quickly in the canyon, swallowing the landscape in shadows. Inside the RV, I felt safe enough, surrounded by my gadgets and the soft hum of electricity. But as I lay in bed, a sound cut through the quiet. Whispers again. I sat up, heart pounding, and peered out the window. The clearing was empty, the stream glinting faintly in the moonlight. Still, the whispers grew louder, like a dozen voices murmuring in a language I couldn't understand. Then I saw it. At the edge of the clearing, near a cluster of rocks, a figure stood motionless. It was tall, too tall, and impossibly thin. Its limbs were elongated, its head slightly cocked as though it were studying me. The moonlight didn't touch it, leaving it in stark silhouette. I blinked, and it was gone. My rational brain kicked in. "You're tired, Kelly. It's just a shadow." But deep down, I knew it wasn't. The next morning, I decided to leave. The canyon was beautiful, yes, but something about it felt wrong. As I packed my gear, I realized the atmosphere had changed. The air felt heavy, suffocating, as if the canyon itself didn't want me to go. I climbed into the driver's seat and started the RV. The engine roared to life, and I felt a surge of relief, until I realized the GPS still wasn't working. Worse, the road out seemed different. No matter which direction I drove, the canyon twisted back on itself, looping endlessly. By noon, I was back at my camp. Panic set in. I tried following the stream, reasoning it would eventually lead me out. But after hours of hiking, I ended up at the same cursed clearing. That night, the whispers returned, louder and clearer than before. They weren't just murmurs now, they were voices. My voice. "Kelly," they said, soft and inviting. "Come outside." I froze, every instinct screaming at me to stay inside. But when I glanced at the window, the watcher was there again, closer this time. Its glowing, hollow eyes locked onto mine, and for a moment, I couldn't move. It was then I remembered the runes I'd seen on the trees. They had to mean something. Grabbing a flashlight and my camera, I ventured outside, driven by a mix of terror and determination. The runes led me to a cairn, a small pile of stones marked with more symbols. It radiated an unnatural cold, and the whispers grew louder as I approached. The watcher stepped into the clearing as I examined the cairn. It was impossibly tall, its limbs contorting like broken branches. Its hollow eyes burned with a pale light, and its voice invaded my mind. "You took what is not yours," it hissed, though its mouth never moved. "This land is mine. You cannot leave." I fell to my knees, overwhelmed by the weight of its presence. Memories I'd buried long ago surfaced, times I'd lied, hurt others, betrayed friends. It fed on my guilt, each mistake a feast for its insidious hunger. Desperate, I remembered a legend I'd read about offerings to appease ancient spirits. Shaking, I removed the locket around my neck, the last gift from my late mother, and placed it on the cairn. The whispers stopped, the watcher froze, its glowing eyes dimming as the locket sank into the cairn. The air shifted, the suffocating weight lifting. I stumbled back to the RV, half expecting the watcher to reappear. But the road out was clear, and the GPS flickered back to life. I didn't stop driving until I was miles from the canyon. Epilogue. I never wrote the blog post. The pictures I'd taken were gone, the drone footage corrupted. But sometimes, late at night, I dream of the watcher, and when I wake, I feel its hollow eyes on me, as though it's waiting for the day I return. I won't, not ever. My name is Rachel Moore. I was 37 years old when this happened, and I've never told anyone the full story, until now. I'd been living in my RV for nearly a year, traveling wherever the road took me. It wasn't about freedom, though. It was about escape. After my younger sister Emma died, I couldn't stay in one place for long. The grief felt like a weight, pressing down on my chest, and I thought that maybe, just maybe, the endless horizon could make it lighter. That's what brought me to Echo Springs. Echo Springs Campground sat at the edge of a dry lake bed in northern Nevada, a forgotten spot marked on my map with a faint circle. It was perfect for what I needed: quiet, solitude, and a backdrop for the blog post I'd promised to write about traveling as a way to heal. I hadn't heard of the place before, but when I saw it, something about the name drew me in. The entrance was barely marked, a faded wooden sign swaying in the desert wind. The road in was rocky and overgrown, but I managed to park my RV in a spot near a cluster of gnarled trees. The campground was deserted, which didn't surprise me. The facilities were long abandoned: broken picnic tables, a rusted-out water pump, and a crumbling office building. I stepped outside and stretched, breathing in the dry desert air. The world around me was eerily silent. No birds, no insects, not even the wind. It felt like the landscape was holding its breath. I told myself I'd get used to it. The first night was uneventful, though I couldn't shake the sense of being watched. I woke early, eager to explore. The dry lake bed stretched out like an endless expanse of white, its surface cracked and brittle. It was beautiful in its desolation. Around mid-morning, I noticed the first toy. It was a spinning top, faded and scuffed, lying in the dirt near my RV. I frowned, picking it up. There were no kids around for miles, and this campground hadn't seen visitors in years. Still, I convinced myself it must have been left behind long ago. By afternoon, the air felt heavier. I went for a walk to clear my head, following a trail that wound through the rocks and trees. But something was off. Landmarks, rocks, twisted trees seemed to shift when I wasn't looking. I'd turn a corner and swear I was walking in circles. The sun was setting when I returned to the RV. That's when I heard it. Faint laughter, like children playing. It came from the direction of the lake bed, rising and falling with the breeze. I froze, my heart pounding. "Hello?" I called out, my voice echoing into the emptiness. No answer. The laughter faded as quickly as it had come. I didn't sleep well that night. Every sound, the creak of the RV, the rustle of the wind, felt magnified. Around midnight, I woke to a soft thudding noise outside. Slowly, I pulled back the curtain of my window. There, at the edge of the clearing, stood a figure. Small, barely illuminated by the moonlight. It was a girl, no older than 10, her hair hanging in wet strands over her face. She wore a dress that clung to her as though she just climbed out of a river. "Are you okay?" I whispered, but the words caught in my throat. She didn't move, didn't speak, just stared at me with eyes that were too dark, too empty. When I blinked, she was gone. I woke the next morning, feeling like I hadn't slept at all. The air inside the RV was stifling, thick with the smell of damp earth. Stepping outside, I found another toy. This time, a ragged doll with one button eye dangling loose. It sat on the step of my RV as though someone had carefully placed it there. I spent the morning searching for answers, wandering the ruins of the campground. In the old office building, I found a dusty guest book. The last entries were dated decades ago, but one caught my attention. Emily Harper, age 9. Disappeared near the lake bed. Please help us find her. I slammed the book shut, a chill running down my spine. By now, the laughter wasn't faint anymore. It came in waves, sometimes sounding playful, other times sharp and desperate. And it wasn't just one voice, it was many. That night, I dreamed of Emma. She was 10 years old again, her blonde hair tied in pigtails, smiling at me as we played near a river. Then the scene shifted. She was drowning, her hands reaching for me as the water pulled her under. I woke gasping, tears streaming down my face. The sound of laughter had turned to whispers, a low hum that filled the RV. And then, like before, the thudding started. This time, I didn't hesitate. Grabbing a flashlight, I stepped outside. The clearing was empty, but the laughter and whispers grew louder, leading me toward the lake bed. The flashlight beam danced over the cracked ground, illuminating footprints, small, barefoot, leading to the center of the lake bed. And there she was. Emily Harper. She stood motionless, her wet hair clinging to her face, her hollow eyes locked on mine. In her hand, she clutched the ragged doll. "You shouldn't be here," she whispered, her voice a rasp like dry leaves. "Why?" I asked, my voice trembling. "They won't let you leave." Suddenly, the laughter erupted into screams, high-pitched, agonized wails that filled the air. Shapes began to form in the darkness. Other children, their bodies twisted and broken, their faces hidden by shadows. They circled me, their movements jerky and unnatural. "Emily," I gasped, backing away. "What do you want?" She stepped closer, her feet dragging across the ground. "You have to stay," she said, her voice breaking. "I'm lonely." The other children began to close in, their shadows stretching toward me like grasping hands. My chest tightened, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. "I can't," I whispered. As the children closed in, I dropped to my knees, clutching my chest. My mind raced back to Emma, to the guilt I'd carried all these years. I hadn't been able to save her, but maybe I could save Emily. "I'm sorry," I said, my voice cracking. "I'm so sorry I couldn't help my sister, but I can help you." Emily stopped, her head tilting as though she were listening. The other children froze, their shadows receding. "Tell them I was here," she whispered. "Don't let them forget us." With that, she turned and walked into the darkness. The other children followed, their laughter fading into silence. By morning, the campground was quiet again. The toys were gone, the guest book missing from the office. My RV started without issue, and the road out of Echo Springs was clear. I never wrote about the trip. Some things are too personal to share, too painful to revisit. But I keep Emily's memory alive in other ways. Small mentions, subtle nods in my writing, and sometimes on quiet nights I hear faint laughter on the wind. A reminder that Echo Springs hasn't truly let me go. My name is Max Reynolds, and I was 27 years old when it happened. This was supposed to be a simple camping trip, just me and my best friend Tyler, but it became something I'll never forget. Something I don't want to remember. It was late October, just as the crisp chill of autumn began to bite at the Nevada desert. I convinced Tyler to join me on this trip to Great Basin National Park. He was hesitant. He always had a love-hate relationship with the outdoors. But after his breakup with Kara, I knew he needed the distraction. Tyler and I hadn't been as close as we once were, and I thought this trip could fix that. Reconnecting in the wilderness seemed like a good idea at the time. We loaded up my RV with camping gear and food, then hit the road. The drive was long, but I didn't mind. Tyler, on the other hand, was quiet most of the way. He stared out the window, lost in thought, while I filled the silence with old rock songs and pointless chatter. When we stopped at a gas station near the park, the grizzled attendant told us about the Lehman Caves and how the stars out here were some of the best in the country. He also told us, in a hushed tone, to avoid wandering too far from camp. "Why's that?" I asked, amused by his seriousness. "Some say there's things out there," he replied. his voice dropping to a whisper. Not animals, not people, something worse. Tyler rolled his eyes, but I could see him shift uncomfortably in his seat. I laughed it off and thanked the guy before we pulled away. We arrived at the campsite late in the afternoon. The sky was painted in warm hues of orange and red as the sun dipped behind the mountains. The park was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that makes you second-guess every noise you hear. We parked near the trailhead to the Lamoille Caves and set up our camp. The RV was our base, but I insisted we pitch a small tent just for fun. Tyler grumbled about it, but eventually gave in. That first night, the stars were breathtaking. I stood outside staring up at the vast expanse, while Tyler fiddled with the stove. The damned thing wouldn't light properly, and I could hear him cursing under his breath. "Maybe you should have brought a working stove," he muttered, glaring at me. "Maybe you should relax," I shot back with a grin. "We're here to enjoy ourselves, remember?" But Tyler wasn't enjoying himself. He kept glancing at the dark woods surrounding us, flinching at every rustle of leaves or snap of a twig. I teased him about being jumpy, but I couldn't deny the unease creeping into my own thoughts. There was something off about this place, something I couldn't put my finger on. The first sign came that night. We were sitting by the fire sharing stories and trying to ignore the cold when Tyler suddenly stiffened. "Did you hear that?" he whispered. "Hear what?" He pointed toward the woods. Someone said my name. I strained my ears, but all I heard was the crackle of the fire and the occasional chirp of crickets. "You're imagining things." But he wasn't convinced. He spent the rest of the night staring into the shadows, and when we finally went to bed, he refused to sleep in the tent. He stayed in the RV, double-checking the locks. The next day, we decided to explore the Lamoille Caves. I thought it would take Tyler's mind off his paranoia. The caves were beautiful, their stalactites and stalagmites forming alien shapes in the dim light, but Tyler's unease only grew. He kept looking over his shoulder, his flashlight darting into the darkness as if he expected something to leap out at him. "I don't like this," he muttered. "It feels wrong." "You're being ridiculous," I said, though I couldn't shake the growing sense that we weren't alone. We argued when we emerged from the caves. Tyler wanted to head back to the RV, but I wanted to keep exploring. He stormed off, leaving me standing there, annoyed and unsure if I should follow. When I returned to camp a few hours later, Tyler was gone. At first, I thought he was just cooling off, but as the sun dipped lower and the shadows grew longer, I started to worry. His jacket was still in the RV, but his flashlight and boots were missing. I called his name, my voice echoing in the stillness, but there was no answer. Then I saw the footprints. They led away from the RV into the woods, my gut twisted as I followed them, my heart pounding in my chest. The deeper I went, the more the forest seemed to close in around me. The trees were gnarled and twisted, their branches clawing at the sky like skeletal fingers. And then I found his watch lying broken in the dirt. That's when I heard it. His voice. "Max, help me." It was faint, coming from deeper in the woods. I ran toward the sound, shouting his name. But something wasn't right. The voice was off. It had the right tone, the right cadence, but it was too perfect, too rehearsed. And then it started calling me by my full name. "Maxwell, come here, Maxwell." I froze. Tyler never called me that. My blood turned to ice as I realized what I was hearing wasn't my friend. I turned to run, but it was too late. I saw it for the first time, a figure standing at the edge of the trees, half hidden in shadow. It was tall, impossibly tall, with limbs that were too long and a face that wasn't quite human. Its eyes glowed like embers, and when it stepped into the light, I saw the decayed flesh hanging from its bones. It opened its mouth, and Tyler's voice came out. "Don't you want to save me?" I stumbled backward, tripping over roots and rocks as it advanced. Its movements were jerky, almost insect-like, and every step it took sent a wave of nausea crashing over me. I ran as fast as I could, my heart pounding in my ears. I didn't stop until I reached the RV, but I wasn't safe. The creature circled the RV, its glowing eyes peering through the windows. It tapped on the glass with long, bony fingers, its voice now mimicking mine. "Let me in, Max. It's safe out here." I knew I couldn't stay in the RV forever. I needed a plan. Desperate, I remembered the caves. Their narrow tunnels could trap the creature, and I could collapse the entrance, burying it inside. But I'd need bait. Me. Grabbing a flare and a knife, I steeled myself and stepped outside. The Wendigo was waiting. It tilted its head as if curious, and began to stalk toward me. I lit the flare and ran, its unearthly howl echoing through the forest as it gave chase. My legs burned. My lungs screamed for air, but I didn't stop. I led it to the cave entrance and plunged inside, the creature's twisted form following close behind. Deeper and deeper I went, until I reached a narrow passage. Squeezing through, I turned and lit the flare's second burst, throwing it toward the Wendigo. The creature recoiled, giving me just enough time to plant the makeshift explosive I'd cobbled together from the RV's propane tank and a bundle of matches. I crawled out of the cave, heart hammering, and detonated the charge. The ground shook as the entrance collapsed, sealing the creature inside. For a moment there was silence. Then the howl came again, muffled but still chilling. It wasn't dead, just trapped. I barely made it back to the RV. My body was covered in cuts and bruises, and my mind was a whirlwind of fear and exhaustion. I drove straight to the nearest ranger station, barely coherent as I told them what had happened. They found nothing. No footprints, no claw marks, no sign of Tyler. The cave entrance was buried, and the rangers chalked it up to a landslide. Weeks later, as I lay in a hospital bed recovering, I heard a voice outside my window. "Maxwell, it's me, Tyler." I didn't look. I couldn't. I knew it was still out there. My name is Riley Carter, and I was 34 when I had the most horrifying experience of my life. I'm a wildlife photographer, the kind of person who thrives on solitude and adventure. My RV is both my home and my office, and I've spent years traveling to remote places in search of beauty and inspiration. But nothing could have prepared me for what happened in Blackwood Pines. It was late September when I arrived in the small town of Blackwood, Nevada, a place so tucked away it felt like time had forgotten it. I'd read about the nearby forest, Blackwood Pines, in an old hiking forum. Supposedly, the area was a hidden gem for photographers, with towering pines, dense underbrush, and a hauntingly serene atmosphere. Perfect for my next blog post. The town itself was quaint, with one gas station, a diner, and a general store. While I stocked up on supplies, the cashier, an elderly woman with wiry gray hair and sharp eyes, struck up a conversation. "You heading to Blackwood Pines?" she asked, her tone cautious. "Yes, planning to camp there for a few days." "I'm a photographer," I replied, patting the camera bag slung over my shoulder. Her expression darkened. "You'd best stay clear of those woods. Folks around here don't go near 'em. Not anymore." "Why not?" I asked, more amused than concerned. "They say the witch of Blackwood Pines curses anyone who trespasses. People get lost, some don't come back. And the ones who do, they ain't right." I smiled politely, dismissing her words as small-town superstition. Thanks for the warning, I said before leaving. By the time I reached the forest, the sun was dipping below the horizon, casting long shadows across the dirt road. Blackwood Pines was everything I'd hoped for. Vast, untouched wilderness with an eerie kind of beauty. I parked my RV in a small clearing and began setting up camp. The air was still, unnervingly so. No birds, no rustling leaves, just silence. That night, under the light of a million stars, I built a small fire and started organizing my gear. As I sorted through my camera lenses, I noticed something strange. Hanging from the trees around my camp were small stick figures, crudely tied together with bits of twine. I frowned. Weird, I muttered, assuming they were left by some overzealous campers trying to spook people. I snapped a few photos, figuring they'd make for an interesting story. The first real warning came the next morning. I was hiking a few miles from camp, looking for good vantage points, when my compass started spinning wildly. I tapped it against my palm, thinking it was broken, but then my GPS lost signal too. Annoyed but undeterred, I pressed on, relying on landmarks to find my way back. Around noon, I stopped to eat and review the photos I'd taken so far. Flipping through the images, I noticed something odd. Several shots had strange distortions, like smudges or shadows that hadn't been there when I'd taken them. In one photo, a tall, blurry figure stood in the background, partially obscured by trees. I told myself it was a trick of the light. But as I packed up to leave, I heard something. Soft, like a child's laugh carried on the wind. My heart raced and I spun around, but there was nothing there. Just trees. "Get it together, Riley," I muttered, shaking off the unease. By the time I got back to camp, the sun was low in the sky. I built another fire and tried to relax, but something felt off. The stillness was oppressive, as if the forest itself were holding its breath. Then, as I sat by the fire, I noticed the stick figures again. There were more of them now, hanging from branches directly above my RV. I stood, heart pounding. "Who's out there?" I called, my voice breaking the silence. There was no answer, just the crackle of the fire. That night, I barely slept. Around midnight, I woke to the sound of footsteps circling the RV. They were slow, deliberate, as if whoever, or whatever, was out there wanted me to know they were close. I clutched a flashlight and my hunting knife, too afraid to move. Eventually, the footsteps stopped, but the fear lingered. The next day, I decided to explore the forest again, hoping the daylight would chase away my unease. But things only got worse. About a mile from camp, I stumbled upon a clearing littered with animal bones, bleached white and arranged in intricate patterns. My stomach turned and I took a few shaky photos before hurrying back to the RV. When I returned, I found deep claw marks raked across the side of the vehicle, as if something had tried to tear its way in. My equipment was scattered, and several items were missing, including my journal and a backup camera lens. And then I heard it again. The laugh. Louder this time, and closer. It sent a chill down my spine. I decided I'd had enough. I started packing, desperate to leave, but as dusk fell, the forest seemed to come alive. Shadows danced in the corners of my vision, and the laughter gave way to whispers, low and insistent. They were saying my name. "Riley, Riley, come here, Riley." That night, I made the mistake of leaving the RV to investigate a sound. A soft knock at the door. When I stepped outside, the air felt heavy, oppressive. My flashlight flickered, casting long, eerie shadows. And then I saw her. At the edge of the clearing stood a figure cloaked in darkness, her features obscured but unmistakably human. Her fingers were impossibly long, her posture hunched and unnatural. She tilted her head as if studying me, and then she spoke. "Why did you come here?" Her voice was like gravel, grating and ancient. I froze, my mind screaming at me to run, but my legs refused to move. I didn't mean to disturb anything," I stammered. She smiled, revealing jagged, blackened teeth. "You shouldn't have come." With that, she vanished into the shadows, leaving me trembling and alone. The hours that followed were a blur of terror. The forest closed in around me, twisting and reshaping itself. No matter which direction I ran, I ended up back at the same clearing. The whispers grew louder, more mocking. My camera began taking photos on its own, each one showing me trapped, screaming, or surrounded by shadowy figures. I tried lighting a fire, hoping it would ward off whatever was tormenting me, but the flames died out as quickly as they started. Exhausted and terrified, I collapsed inside the RV, clutching my knife and praying for daylight. When morning finally came, the forest was silent again. I drove out of there as fast as I could, my hands shaking on the wheel. When I reached the town, I told the rangers what had happened, but they dismissed my story, saying there were no signs of claw marks, stick figures, or fires. I left Blackwood that same day, vowing never to return. Weeks later, as I was reviewing the photos from my trip, I found one I hadn't taken. It showed the RV parked in the clearing, with a shadowy figure standing just behind it, watching me. I don't know if she was real or a figment of my fear, but I do know one thing. Some places are meant to be left alone. My name is Caleb Winters, and I was 29 years old when I made the biggest mistake of my life. I'm a writer, and my job takes me to strange, often unsettling places. Urban legends, haunted towns, cryptic myths. If it's weird or creepy, I chase it. It's a thrill, uncovering the truth behind the stories people are too scared to talk about. But what happened in Devil's Hollow is something I'll never write about publicly. Some truths aren't worth uncovering. It started in the small, dusty town of Red Rock, Nevada. I was passing through, chasing rumors about Devil's Hollow, a desolate canyon a few miles away. According to local lore, it was home to an abandoned ghost town where settlers mysteriously vanished in the late 1800s. People whispered about the whispers of Devil's Hollow, strange voices that lured wanderers into the canyon, never to return. I'd heard it all before. Stories like this are a dime a dozen. But something about this one intrigued me. Maybe it was the isolation of the place, or the lack of documentation about what really happened. Either way, I knew I had to check it out. Before heading into the canyon, I stopped by the local library to do some research. That's where I met Maggie, a frail, silver-haired woman who seemed to know everything about the town and its dark past. When I told her I was planning to camp in Devil's Hollow, she gave me a look of genuine concern. "You don't want to go out there," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "People don't come back the same, if they come back at all." I laughed nervously. "I appreciate the warning, but I'll be fine. I've been to plenty of places like this." "This isn't like other places," she said, leaning in. "The whispers, they're not just stories. They'll get inside your head, and once they do, there's no escaping them." Her words stayed with me as I left, but not enough to stop me. Legends always had a way of getting exaggerated, and I wasn't about to let fear ruin my next big story. By late afternoon, I'd reached Devil's Hollow. The canyon stretched before me, a vast expanse of red rock formations that seemed to glow under the setting sun. At its heart lay the ghost town, a cluster of crumbling buildings long forgotten by time. I parked my RV at the edge of the canyon, unloaded my gear, and set off to explore. The town was eerily quiet. The silence wasn't just an absence of noise, it was oppressive, like the land itself was holding its breath. Most of the buildings were little more than skeletons of wood and stone, but I could see traces of the people who'd once lived here. Rusted tools, broken dishes, a child's doll lying in the dirt. I spent hours photographing the ruins, documenting every detail for my blog. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, I was exhausted but exhilarated. I returned to the RV, ready to review my work, but something about the darkness unsettled me. It wasn't just the absence of light. It felt alive, as if it were watching me. That night, the first dream came. I was standing in the middle of the ghost town, but it wasn't abandoned. The buildings were whole, the streets bustling with activity. Men tipped their hats to me, women nodded politely, and children laughed as they played. But their eyes were hollow, dark voids that seemed to pierce straight through me. When I woke, my heart was racing. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was just my imagination running wild. But then I heard it. A whisper, soft and barely audible, coming from outside the RV. "Caleb!" I froze, every muscle in my body tensing. It wasn't possible. No one knew I was here. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it through the window, but there was nothing outside, just darkness. I told myself it was the wind. I had to believe that. The next morning, I ventured deeper into the ghost town, determined to find answers. That's when I found the well. It sat in the center of the town square, its stones cracked and worn. Something about it drew me in. I peered inside, but it was too dark to see the bottom. As I leaned closer, a soft voice echoed up from the depths. "Help me!" I stumbled back, nearly tripping over my own feet. The voice sounded like a child's, a little girl. My rational mind told me it wasn't possible, but I couldn't ignore it. Against my better judgment, I lowered a flashlight into the well, but it revealed nothing except damp stone walls. I spent the rest of the day combing through the town, finding more unsettling clues. A child's shoe, perfectly clean despite the dust. A journal in the church, its final entries scrawled in frantic, illegible handwriting. Claw marks raked across the wooden pews. Each discovery sent a chill down my spine. That night, the whispers returned. This time, they were louder, more insistent. They seemed to come from everywhere surrounding the RV. "Caleb, Caleb, come outside!" I tried to ignore them, but the sound was maddening. It wasn't just voices, it was laughter, cries, and something else, a guttural growl that made my skin crawl. Finally, I grabbed my knife and stepped outside, determined to confront whatever was out there. The town was empty, but I could feel it watching me. Then I saw her. A little girl standing at the edge of the square, her blonde braids glinting in the moonlight. She stared at me with wide, frightened eyes. "You shouldn't be here," she whispered. Before I could respond, she turned and ran toward the well. I chased after her, shouting for her to stop, but when I reached the well, she was gone. My flashlight revealed nothing, just the same damp stone walls. The next day, I pieced together the story. The journal hinted at what had happened. The settlers had unearthed something in the mines, something they couldn't explain. Whatever it was, it drove them to madness. They tried to seal it away, but it was too late. The whispers had already taken hold. As the sun set, I felt the weight of their presence. The spirits of the townspeople were everywhere now, their hollow eyes staring at me from the shadows. They didn't speak, but their intent was clear. I wasn't welcome here. Desperate, I tried to start the RV, but the engine sputtered and died. I was trapped. That night was the worst. The whispers became screams, deafening and relentless. The townspeople surrounded the RV, their faces pressed against the windows, their mouths moving in silent curses. The little girl appeared again, crying, begging me to leave. But I couldn't. The RV wouldn't move, and the darkness outside felt alive, ready to swallow me whole. Then I saw it. The thing from the well. It was massive, a shifting, shadowy form with eyes that burned like coals. It reached for me, its claws raking against the RV, and I knew I had to escape. I don't remember much about how I got out. I grabbed my camera, bolted into the night, and ran until my legs gave out. Somehow, I made it back to Red Rock, collapsing on the steps of the library. Maggie found me there and took me inside. When I showed her the photos, they were blank. All except one. A picture of me standing at the well, surrounded by the hollow-eyed townspeople. To this day, I can still hear the whispers when I'm alone. My name is Jack Harper, and I was 39 years old when this happened. It was the summer of 2022, a blistering hot July afternoon, and my wife Carrie, my 8-year-old son Dylan, and I were on an RV trip through Nevada. We wanted to explore the history of the state, the ghost towns, the abandoned mines, all the places where life once thrived but had long since withered away. I thought it would be educational. I thought it would be fun, but I didn't think it would change everything. We were headed toward Rhyolite, a ghost town near Death Valley. I'd read about it online. Crumbling ruins, eerie sculptures, and stories of miners who chased fortune only to leave behind despair. It was the kind of place that drew people like me, history buffs who liked to imagine what life was like 100 years ago. Carrie wasn't thrilled. "Another ghost town?" she said as we bounced along the dusty road. "Jack, you're turning this trip into one big history lesson. Can't we just go to a lake or something?" "Come on, it'll be quick," I promised. "We'll explore for a couple of hours, take some pictures, and head back to civilization." Dylan, sitting in the back with his headphones on, perked up. "A ghost town? Are there real ghosts?" "Just the history kind," I said with a chuckle. Looking back, I should have listened to Carrie. We parked the RV just outside the ruins. The sun blazed down, turning the ground into a shimmering, cracked wasteland. The air was dry, heavy, and silent. No birds, no bugs. Just the occasional gust of wind stirring up dust. "This place gives me the creeps," Carrie muttered as we stepped out. Dylan, however, was thrilled. "Look, there's a broken house, and over there it's like a fort." He dashed toward the remains of an old bank, its walls pockmarked with time and weather. "Stay close," I called after him. The town was a skeleton. Stone and wood buildings stood half collapsed, their insides gutted. Signs of life were scattered everywhere. Rusted cans, broken tools, a mangled wagon wheel. It was easy to imagine the people who once lived here, scraping by in the heat and dust. We wandered toward what must have been the town square. Dylan tugged on my sleeve. "Dad, do you hear that?" "Hear what?" He tilted his head, listening. "Laughing. Like kids laughing." Carrie and I exchanged a glance. I didn't hear a thing, just the wind whistling through the ruins. "It's probably just your imagination," I said. But Dylan was insistent. "No, it's coming from over there." He pointed toward a cluster of broken-down buildings near an old playground. The playground was eerie. A rusted swing set stood crooked, its chain swaying slightly in the wind. Nearby, a seesaw lay on its side, half buried in dirt. The ground was littered with shards of glass and splinters. "Be careful," Carrie warned, as Dylan ran ahead. He stopped by the swings, staring at them with wide eyes. "Maggie says she used to play here." I frowned. "Who's Maggie?" "She's right there," Dylan said matter-of-factly, pointing to the empty swing. "Dylan," Carrie said gently, "there's no one there." "She says she lived here when the town was full of people," Dylan continued, ignoring her. "Her daddy worked in the mine, but then she got sick." I felt a chill despite the heat. "That's enough, buddy. Let's keep moving." But Dylan wouldn't budge. "She says you shouldn't go near the church." Things got stranger after that. As we explored, we started noticing things that didn't make sense. Small footprints in the dust, too fresh to belong to anyone from the town's heyday. Objects moved slightly out of place, an old tin cup that seemed to roll uphill, a toppled chair that wasn't toppled a moment ago. Carrie was visibly on edge. "I don't like this, Jack. Let's just go." "Relax," I said, though I felt uneasy too. "It's just the wind or animals or something." That's when we heard it. A soft, faint laugh drifting on the breeze. This time, Carrie and I both heard it. "Dylan?" Carrie whispered. "It wasn't me," he said, his face pale. By the time we decided to head back to the RV, the sun was starting to dip below the horizon. The long shadows of the ruins stretched across the ground, twisting into shapes that looked almost alive. Dylan kept glancing over his shoulder, clutching my hand tightly. "Dad," he said, "Maggie says we need to leave before he comes." "Before who comes?" "The man in red," Dylan whispered. Carrie grabbed my arm. "Jack, he's scared. We need to go now." "Fine," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. "We're leaving." We were almost to the RV when it happened. The entire vehicle shifted, groaning as if something heavy had slammed into it. "What the hell?" I shouted, rushing forward. The air suddenly smelled acrid, like sulfur and burnt wood. Dylan screamed, pointing toward the ruins. At the edge of the shadows stood a figure. He was tall, his silhouette sharp and menacing against the twilight. His face was obscured, but his eyes glowed faintly like embers. He wore what looked like a tattered red coat. "The man in red," Dylan whimpered. Carrie grabbed Dylan and pulled him close. "Get in the RV, now!" Inside, the RV felt suffocating. The lights flickered and the sulfuric smell was even stronger. Outside, the figure stood motionless, watching. "What is he?" Carrie whispered. I didn't have an answer. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening. Dylan sat on the floor hugging his knees. "He wants me to stay," he said softly. "No one's staying," I said, trying to sound confident. Then the banging started. Slow, deliberate thuds against the side of the RV. Each one made the entire vehicle shudder. I remembered the salt. It was a ridiculous idea, but I was desperate. I grabbed the container from the kitchen and began pouring it around the RV's doors and windows. "What are you doing?" Carrie asked. "Just trust me," I said. The banging stopped. For a moment, everything was silent. Then a voice, low and gravelly, came from outside. "Give me the boy," it said. Carrie clutched Dylan tighter. "You're not taking him," she screamed. I felt a surge of anger. "You can't have him," I shouted, though my hands were trembling. The figure stepped closer, but as soon as it reached the salt line, it stopped. Its glowing eyes narrowed. Dylan whispered, "Maggie says he can't cross it." "Then we wait him out," I said. We stayed awake all night. The three of us huddled together in the RV. The figure never moved, but we could feel its presence, oppressive and suffocating. As the first light of dawn broke over the horizon, the figure faded into the shadows. The sulfuric smell disappeared. The air felt lighter. "We're leaving," I said, starting the engine. Dylan looked back at the ruins as we drove away. "Maggie says thank you," he said quietly. For what? Carrie asked. She says I'm safe now, but she has to stay. I glanced at him in the rearview mirror. His expression was calm, but his voice had changed, just slightly. Thanks for letting me tag along, he said with a small smile. It wasn't Dylan's voice, we never spoke of Rhyolite again. But sometimes, late at night, I hear faint laughter, and I wonder if we ever truly left. My name is Tyler Grayson. I was 34 years old when this happened, and not a day has passed since without thinking about it. I'm a wildlife photographer, mostly self-taught, but good enough that magazines started taking notice. This story begins in the summer of 2021 when I set out to photograph a rare owl in Humboldt-Toyabe National Forest, Nevada. What I found instead was something I can't fully explain. It started, as most of my trips do, a long drive, followed by a hike into the remote wilderness. My RV served as both my home and base camp, and it was parked at the edge of a trailhead deep in the forest. The road to get there had been rough. Potholes, washed-out sections, the works. But that's the price you pay for isolation. The plan was simple. Spend a week capturing the beauty of the forest and, if luck favored me, get a shot of the elusive silver-winged owl, a species so rare it bordered on myth. I had my camera gear, survival supplies, and plenty of time. What could go wrong? The first few days passed uneventfully. I'd scouted the area, found promising spots to set up my equipment, and spent my evenings by a small fire outside the RV. The forest was stunning. Towering pines stretching to the heavens, their dense canopy filtering sunlight into golden beams. But something about the place felt off. The air was heavy, too still, as if the forest was holding its breath. There were no birds chirping, no rustling of small animals in the underbrush. Just an oppressive silence broken only by the occasional whisper of wind. On the third day, I noticed something odd. While hiking a narrow trail, I found claw marks on a tree, deep, jagged gashes, as though something with massive talons had raked against it. At first, I assumed it was a bear, but the spacing between the marks didn't match any animal I knew. I snapped a photo, trying not to dwell on it. That night, I set up a camera trap near a glacial lake. The area had the eerie beauty of untouched wilderness, still water reflecting the moonlight, framed by dark, ancient trees. I stayed longer than I should have, absorbed in capturing the perfect shot of the moonlit lake. By the time I returned to the RV, it was nearly midnight. As I approached, I noticed the forest felt different, darker, colder. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, though I couldn't say why. I climbed into the RV, locked the door, and told myself I was just tired. Then I heard it. A screech, sharp and inhuman, somewhere deep in the forest. It wasn't an owl, or at least not any owl I'd ever heard. It sounded like something trying to mimic an owl, but failing. Its pitch too high, its cadence too uneven. I froze, every nerve in my body screaming for me to stay inside. Eventually, the sound faded, leaving behind an even heavier silence. I forced myself to sleep, though I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The next morning, I reviewed the footage from the camera trap. Most of it was typical, leaves swaying in the breeze, the occasional squirrel darting by, until the last clip. At first, I didn't notice anything unusual. Then, at the edge of the frame, I saw it. A gaunt figure, humanoid but distorted, with unnaturally long limbs and hollow, glowing eyes. It stood perfectly still, half hidden behind a tree, watching the camera. My stomach turned. I rewound the clip, convinced it had to be a trick of the light. But it wasn't. For For the rest of the day, I couldn't shake the image of those hollow eyes. I told myself it was nothing, a trick of perspective, maybe some weird reflection, but I couldn't bring myself to stay out after dark again. The next night, things escalated. I was inside the RV, editing photos, when I heard scratching at the door. It was faint at first, almost imperceptible. Then it grew louder, more deliberate. Long, scraping sounds like claws dragging across metal. My heart raced as I grabbed a flashlight and peered out the window. Nothing. The scratching stopped, replaced by a low guttural growl that seemed to come from all around me. My flashlight flickered, the beam weak and shaky as I swept it across the forest. Shadows danced between the trees, but no clear figure emerged. I didn't sleep that night. By the 5th day, I'd had enough. I decided to cut the trip short and leave. But when I started down the trail back to the main road, I found it blocked. Trees had fallen across the path, their trunks splintered and jagged as though they'd been torn down by something impossibly strong. I tried another route, but the same thing happened. It was as if the forest itself was conspiring to trap me. Panic set in. I stumbled back to the RV, my breaths shallow and frantic. As I neared it, I saw something that stopped me in my tracks. Symbols carved into the trees around my campsite. They weren't random marks, they formed a pattern, intricate and deliberate. Then I saw the figure again. It stood at the edge of the clearing, its hollow eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. This time, it didn't stay still. It moved toward me, its motions jerky and unnatural, like a puppet being yanked by invisible strings. I bolted for the RV, slamming the door shut behind me. The creature's footsteps were heavy and uneven, crunching against the forest floor. Inside, I grabbed my camera and reviewed the footage from the last few days. Every clip showed the same thing, the creature lurking in the background, closer each time. The final straw came that night. The creature attacked. It slammed against the RV with inhuman strength, shaking the entire vehicle. The windows rattled, and the walls groaned as though they might collapse. I remembered something I'd read years ago about fire-repelling spirits. Desperate, I grabbed the small propane tank from my supplies and lit a makeshift torch. When the creature appeared at the window, I thrust the torch toward it. The flame reflected in its hollow eyes, and it recoiled, retreating into the shadows. I didn't wait to see if it would come back. The next morning, I found a dirt road leading out of the forest and drove non-stop until I reached the nearest town. I didn't tell anyone what happened. I wouldn't have known where to start. Weeks later, I reviewed all the photos and footage I'd taken in the forest. In nearly every shot, I found the same haunting figure watching from the shadows. I submitted the best photos to the magazine, but I've never gone back to the forest. Some places are better left alone. My name is Rachel Novak, and I was 28 years old when I heard the cursed song. I was traveling alone in my RV, exploring the Ruby Mountains in Nevada for my YouTube channel. It was supposed to be a routine trip, hiking, filming, and showcasing the natural beauty of the area. Instead, it became a descent into something I still don't fully understand, a dark melody that has haunted me ever since. It started innocently enough. The Ruby Mountains were breathtaking. Jagged peaks, sprawling meadows, and an unshakable sense of isolation. I parked my RV at a trailhead miles from the nearest town, ready to spend the next 3 days hiking and filming. The goal was to capture the wild beauty of the region and, if I was lucky, stumble across something unique for my channel. I'd heard local legends about the mountains, a mix of mining tragedies and strange disappearances, but one story caught my attention: the Devil's Choir. According to the legend, Hikers had reported hearing an eerie song echoing through the mountains at night. No one knew where it came from, but those who followed it were never seen again. It sounded like the perfect hook for my video, a creepy folklore angle to spice up the usual nature shots. I didn't take it seriously, of course. I've spent enough time outdoors to know that people exaggerate, their imaginations running wild in the dark. Still, it was a good story, and I plan to mention it in my video. My first day was uneventful. I hiked a well-worn trail, filming the stunning vistas and talking to the camera about the area's history. The mountains were quiet, too quiet in hindsight. No birds, no insects, just the occasional whisper of wind. I dismissed it as the stillness of high-altitude wilderness and focused on my work. That night, as I sat by the fire editing footage, I heard it for the first time. A melody, faint, distant, and hauntingly beautiful. At first, I thought it was a trick of the wind, but the notes were too deliberate, too precise. It sounded like a choir, their voices rising and falling in perfect harmony. I grabbed my microphone and hit record, thinking I'd stumbled onto something incredible. As I listened, though, a chill crept up my spine. The melody wasn't just eerie, it felt wrong, like it didn't belong in this world. It was too complex, too layered, as if it were being sung by something that understood music on a level far beyond human comprehension. I recorded for about 10 minutes before the song faded into silence. My rational mind told me it was probably some strange acoustic phenomenon, maybe the wind carrying sounds from a distant campsite. But part of me wasn't convinced. The next day, I set out to explore a lesser-known trail I'd read about online. It wasn't marked on any official maps, but I'd found a blog post describing it as hidden and magical. That was exactly the kind of place I loved to find for my videos, so I followed the vague directions and spent hours weaving through dense forest and rocky slopes. Eventually, I stumbled upon something strange. A clearing with an old stone altar in the center. The altar was covered in moss, its surface cracked and weathered with age. Surrounding it were the remnants of what looked like a ritual, burned-out candles, shards of pottery, and faint traces of ash. It was the kind of discovery that would normally excite me, perfect for a spooky video. But this time, I felt uneasy. The air in the clearing was heavy, oppressive. My instincts screamed at me to leave, but curiosity got the better of me. I filmed the altar from every angle, narrating my theories about what it might have been used for. As I packed up my gear, I realized I'd been humming. It was the melody from the night before. That night, back in the RV, the nightmares began. I dreamed of faceless figures standing in a circle, chanting the same haunting melody. Their voices were low, guttural, and filled with an ancient sorrow that seemed to seep into my very bones. I woke up drenched in sweat, the song still echoing in my ears. When I checked my camera footage, things got worse. Every shot of the clearing was corrupted. The video was filled with static, and distorted images of shadowy figures flickered in the background. My audio recordings were worse. The choir was louder, clearer, and unmistakably supernatural. I told myself it was just a technical glitch, but the unease wouldn't go away. That night, the singing returned, louder and closer. It wasn't a distant melody anymore. It was right outside the RV. I tried to leave the next morning, but the forest wouldn't let me. The trail I'd followed to the clearing was gone, replaced by a dense tangle of trees and underbrush. I tried another path, but it led me in circles, always back to the same spot. It was as if the mountains had shifted, trapping me in their labyrinth. Desperation set in. I spent hours combing through the forest, searching for a way out. That's when I found the journal. It was hidden in the remains of an old campsite, tucked inside a rusted tin box. The pages were yellowed and brittle, written in the shaky hand of someone on the brink of madness. The journal belonged to a prospector who had ventured into the Ruby Mountains in the late 1800s. He wrote about a coven of witches who had performed a dark ritual to summon a demon. The ritual had failed, but it left behind a curse, an eternal melody that lured people to their doom. The prospector described the same altar I'd found and warned that once the song had been heard, it could never be forgotten. The only way to break the curse, he wrote, was to destroy the source. I knew what I had to do. That night, the singing returned, louder and more insistent than ever. I armed myself with a hammer and a can of lighter fluid, determined to destroy the altar. The faceless figures from my nightmares appeared outside the RV, their forms barely visible in the moonlight. They didn't move, didn't speak, just stood there, humming the cursed melody. The hike back to the clearing was the longest of my life. The air grew colder with every step, and the melody seemed to wrap around me, pulling me closer. When I reached the altar, the figures materialized in the shadows, circling me with their guttural chants. I poured the lighter fluid over the stone and struck a match. The flames roared to life, illuminating the clearing in an orange glow. The figures screamed, their voices rising into a deafening crescendo as they dissolved into the darkness. As the altar crumbled, the song finally stopped. I made it back to the RV and drove out of the mountains without stopping. I didn't care about the footage, the video, or anything else. I just wanted to leave. Weeks later, I reviewed the corrupted footage. In the final clip, as the flames consumed the altar, a shadowy figure appeared in the background, watching. And in the silence that followed, I could still hear the faint echo of the cursed melody. Some songs, it seems, are never truly forgotten.